Well, good evening, everybody. Actually, it's good morning there and good evening for me. My name is Courtney Zietzk. I am your instructor this evening, as usual, for the sixth of the webinar series on World War I. So I hope everybody is comfortable. Enjoy and reflect for the next hour, and I will be your guide through World War I. Got some interesting things we're going to talk about today that I think you'll be very intrigued about what's happening with Adolf Hitler. Well, what did happen with Adolf Hitler. So let's begin. I'm going to go ahead and fire up the first of two PowerPoints this evening. And the first one is where we left off the last time. And we were on the slide number 26, I believe. Is where we left off, and just to kind of go through a very brief summary and recap of what we've learned so far. We have the Axis and Allied powers of World War II, and these powers were extremely, as far as the Allies were concerned, we talked about numerical superiority of the Allied powers versus the Axis power. And one only has to look at a geographical map to figure out that the Allied powers had a vastly superior forces, not only in people, but as far as raw materials. And this is what would serve the United States in particular very, very well. Now we're getting into the World War II European theater of operations, and you could see very clearly that when the war would begin, Adolf Hitler was basically moving across Europe with almost, with zero, almost no resistance at all. He moved into Poland in September of 1939, and we will get into this. And it's pretty obvious that he could not be stopped in Europe. When he got to France, he took France. There's a very famous picture of Adolf Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower. It was like the ultimate insult of the world that your sworn enemy is now in your capital and basically doing anything they want. And what they did, they got to the English Channel and started to bombard England during World War II. And we're going to get into that in specifics, but I just want to kind of tell you, just kind of give you a little preview about what we're going to be learning and a little bit about why did this happen? Because all this could have been avoided, really, and historians all believe the same thing. If the Treaty of Versailles would not have been so lopsided against Germany, Hitler would not have had the platform he had to basically take control over Germany, because they gave him the chancellorship from a political bargain, as we learned before, and then he became, for all intents and purposes, a dictator. He would have never had that platform to be, to garner that much and marshal that much power that they eventually gave him. So it's interesting to figure out, how did all this happen? It wasn't pre-designed. It was just a sad fate of circumstance. Hitler was able to come to power. But it's, from a standpoint of trying to make all this sense of all this, first we've got to go back to World War I and figure out why was Europe in trouble in the first place, which we already know what was going on. We had a tremendous problem with, a feudalistic type Europe environment where people were not given the opportunity that they wanted and needed in a lot of the cases, but also the structure of the government. Alliances were being set up, and it was a rich man's fight, but a poor man's war is what the big criticism was, which is what was happening in World War I. Also, it would happen in World War II, but not quite as pronounced, because World War II was such a wider range of a conflict that involved more and more people than World War I. But you can go all the way back and figure out that there was going to be some problems in Europe. So let's begin, because when Hitler came to power, we've already discovered that power would become absolute. He would employ this thing called the German miracle, which we will do. And then we will get into the war years in the last three PowerPoints and the last three lessons of this webinar. We're going to be talking exclusively about World War II and the fighting and how it all began. But first, let's take a look at how we got it all set up. So here we are. We're looking at the Allied and Axis powers of World War II. The Allied powers consisted of Great Britain, France, China, Soviet Union from 1941, and the United States from 1941. Interestingly enough, the United States again did not want to be a part of this war. We said, look, we've already done it once. We don't want to do it again. But unfortunately, history would take a different turn. The Axis powers, as you know, were Germany, Italy, and the Empire of Japan. Interestingly enough, in 1940 is when the Empire of Japan would formally join the Axis power agreements, and they would sign the treaty that's saying, okay, we're all together now. How do you want to take over the world is pretty much what they were thinking about doing. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, first we have the Allied leaders and their role of World War II. We have Neville Chamberlain. He appeased Hitler, tried to avoid the war. He knew darn well that Hitler was much more powerful than he was, because Hitler was actually a better world leader than he was. And I don't think there's anybody anywhere that would disagree with that. What he did initially for Germany was remarkable. He saved the entire economy. He put millions of people back to work, and he rebuilt their country as well as their military almost as fast as he could. That leads to opportunities and growth for the German people. But they didn't realize when he first started what his true objectives would ultimately be, which would be to try to take over Europe and probably all of Africa is what he had his eyes on. So let's get into this. Okay, Britain's prime minister was Winston Churchill. He was a great leader, a motivator of the British people. He told the Germans that we will never, ever surrender. He was a great leader. Neville Chamberlain was a good leader, but he tried to appease Hitler, which was a mistake. Then we had France, Charles de Gaulle, the great Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free France. He's still revered in France today as one of the greatest leaders that country has ever had. And then we had Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Wanted to spread communism. History would prove that Joseph Stalin was actually a worse tyrant than actually Adolf Hitler was. Franklin Delano Roosevelt brought the US into the war rather reluctantly, but then realized that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that war was altogether absolutely imminent. The US would be thrown into the war as of December 7th, 1941, when the Empire of Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. The US would go into this thing full tilt. We would declare war on the Empire of Japan actually the very next day. And then interestingly enough, Adolf Hitler, because of the Axis power agreement he had with Japan, Adolf Hitler would actually declare war on the United States the day after we declared war on Japan. Many people believe, many historians believe, I certainly believe it, that when you start reading all the stuff that happened, this was Hitler's second greatest mistake in succession. But many historians believe that it was Hitler's worst mistake, was to be involving the United States by declaring war on the United States. We have Harry S. Truman that took over from Franklin Delano Roosevelt when Roosevelt would pass away. He would die in Warm Springs, Georgia in 1945, in April of 1945. And then we have China's Chiang Kai-shek, nationalist leader over China. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Okay, Axis leaders and their roles in World War II. Country, Germany. Adolf Hitler wanted to create an empire for German-speaking people, started the war by invading the neighboring countries. That obviously, the first one that he did was Poland. Now, it's very important you understand this, because Hitler was eyeballing a lot of countries. In fact, he actually invaded, but basically walked into Austria, completely unopposed. People actually in Austria wanted this to happen. They wanted to be united with Germany because Germany was doing so well economically and militarily. They wanted to be part of Germany. The second time he did this, though, he marched into Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia was a little bit more tense because European leaders realized that we've got to reel Hitler in or we could find ourselves in another world war. So they appeased him. They said, look, Adolf Hitler, We understand you got all your land back from the last war, World War I, but don't go any further. Now you have all your land back. You've got all your stuff. We're not going to oppose you. Don't go any further. And guess what he did? He went further. Okay, Italy, we have Benito Mussolini, allied with Hitler so he could build a large Italian empire. Hitler revered Mussolini because he was a staunch supporter of a dictatorial type government. And Hideki Tojo, military director or dictator of Japan. Emperor Hirohito was a symbolic leader of Japan who told his people to surrender after the atomic bomb was dropped. Let's get into this. Okay, so these are the main players. Okay, what message is the artist trying to convey with this political cartoon? Forgive me, comrade, but it seemed such a good opportunity. Well, and how does he feel about Hitler, Lenin? Explain your reasoning. I'm not going to get into what people think, but it's pretty darn clear that you could see Hitler stabbing Joseph Stalin in the back. Remember, they had the Treaty of Lvovsk, and Hitler would simply break the treaty. Many people believe that that was Hitler's downfall, would be to attack Russia, and it would be. Okay, the European theater of operations as we begin. In Europe and the surrounding areas, Western Front, battles fought in Western Europe, mainly Great Britain, France, and the United States, versus Germany and Italy. The Eastern Front is the battles fought in Eastern Europe, mainly between Germany and the Soviet Union. Africa battles fought in the deserts of North Africa, and this is between Germany and Italy, and Germans wanted to control the Suez Canal in order to have access to the oil-rich Middle East. Okay, this is something that they absolutely cannot possibly allow Hitler to do, was to control the Suez Canal. It's like today, two major waterways of the world are the Suez Canal, which links Europe to the Middle East and to Asia through the Suez Canal. And of course, we have the Panama Canal in for South America and Central America, where it's located, which obviously is tremendously valuable for transportation and logistics. Okay, but Hitler sure wanted that. Okay, as we continue to go further. Okay, the human cost of World War II. Obviously, Europe was the most devastating war in all of world history. Fighting cost the lives of millions of soldiers on both sides, and 60 million soldiers were killed. That doesn't include civilian casualties and casualties that would be found on the Pacific theater of operations, which were never counted initially to begin with. World War I would cost the lives of approximately 100 million people. Because keep in mind, you have to count the dead after they've been injured and they will be killed because of the war. Many people were alive after the war, but they died of injuries because of the war, and those are counted as war casualties. Okay, the majority of European deaths were civilian, as air bombings left cities in shambles, and the war also destroyed much of the countryside. It was bad. Many people were homeless, and famine and disease spread throughout the cities, thereby killing more people. Now we talk about the Holocaust. The Holocaust would kill the lives of 6 million Jews. And Tokyo lost 2 million people in the city of Tokyo. Tokyo was heavily damaged, while Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because of the atomic bombs, were absolutely obliterated. Okay. The reason I'm going through this now is to kind of give you a real perspective of what we're going to be learning about the details of this. Now, remember, class, and my fellow webinar participants here, is that remember what Germany looked like in 1936, before the war even started. Germany was the envy of Europe and probably the envy of the world. In fact, Adolf Hitler had done such a fantastic job of rebuilding his country, rebuilding his military, providing for his people, providing jobs, employment, opportunities, food on the table, a future, that people don't realize that how good of a job he actually did. In fact, they showcased Hitler's Germany in the 1936 Olympics. And when I'm going to show you during this webinar presentation about how things could be going so great for Germany in 1936, and then in 1945, when the war was concluded in the European theater of operations, Berlin, which was the home of the 1936 Olympics, was absolutely 100% obliterated. In fact, the damage was so extensive to Germany and to the city of Berlin in particular that major restorative effort and rebuilding was not completed until 1989. So it took 44 years to finally be able to rebuild Germany to what it is today. That's how extensive the damage actually was. It was amazing. What I want to do with this presentation is kind of go over some of the things that happened, and then we're going to get into the particulars. And that's exactly how I like to teach my classes, to give everybody a good idea of what happened. Now we're going to figure out why these happened. And that is a particularly effective way to teach this class, because people now know what happened. Now we're going to think about and learn why these happened and what happened and where did it lead to. As everybody knows, or should know, those of you who are World War II buffs or World War II people, is that the World War II, as bad as it was clearly not as bad as things to come, because World War II would lead to the Cold War. Now, obviously, if you look at human tragedies and mortality rates, yeah, World War II is the worst thing that ever happened. But what happened in the Cold War was far more dangerous. Because did World War II affect every single country on Earth? No, it did not. There's places in South America that were not even touched. There's places in probably some parts of Southeast Asia that were not even touched. Some places in Africa that wasn't really affected by the war. But the Cold War was everybody's problem. Because the Cold War, we have the ability now to destroy the entire world. And that's because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Much, much more dangerous. And I urge you to learn all you can about the Cold War and what it would lead to in the culmination of this East versus West philosophy that would lead us to the brink of a nuclear war in October of 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so let's continue with this. As you can see very clearly, we had a tremendous amount of casualties of World War II. And we have an estimated number of people killed by the Nazis. Okay, 6 million Jews. It was actually more than that. They're still finding evidence of Nazis' crimes all over Europe. But for the sake of this PowerPoint is concerned, we'll just basically, go with what we have here. But what we have here, folks, is we've got approximately, looks like close to 15 million people killed by the Nazis in and around World War II. An absolute tragedy. Okay, the impact of World War II in both civilians and soldiers. Okay, I'm going to break away from this PowerPoint in just a few minutes because I want to get into some of the details, a little bit more of Germany before we get into the real nitty gritty of World War II on the next PowerPoint. Okay, the impact of World War II, both civilians and soldiers. This is important. The Allied home front played an important role in winning the war. This is critical because what the US would do would actually absolutely positively affect not only the outcome of this World War II, but of this world in general, of what we were able to accomplish and the influence it would and the impact that it would have on the rest of the world. Okay, factories produced weapons and supply for the war. Many women worked in all the factories. The Allies used propaganda to strengthen and support the war and to help conserve materials and resources, since there would be an eventual shortage of consumer goods. This is very important. Now remember, what was the United States doing before World War II? Well, in 1929, if you've ever looked about what happened because we have the stock market crash, we were in a Great Depression, and this Great Depression was taking its toll on the United States, and it ravaged the economies of Europe. Bad thing was going on. So the United States was still trying to recover from the Great Depression. And for the most part, in 1939, when World War II would actually begin, the United States was well on its way to becoming, pretty much at this point, we were getting out of the Great Depression, but we weren't altogether already there yet. However, World War II would change that to the United States almost absolutely immediately. World War II would transform the American economy into a supercharged world power economy almost overnight. Because of the United States, its educated people, its resources, its logistics and transportation networks, the United States would now rely on its transportation and resources and people to build one of the most fortified arsenals in world history. What's important to understand is that World War II would end the Great Depression almost immediately, because the United States would go into what they call a war footing, and we would have massive production efforts all over the United States, building 300,000 plus combat aircraft. We would build hundreds of major ships, tanks, weapons, guns. Incredible amount of industrial production would ensue for this war effort. And when you have production like that, you have employment and you have a turbocharged economy. That's what happened because of this World War. Okay, so let's get back into this. A little sidebar there. How did anti-Semitism become part of Nazi ideology? Religious and cultural differences, coupled with suspicion and envy, had made the Hebrew people frequent scapegoats during times of crisis throughout the history of Europe. Increased movement by Jews into the mainstream of some European life led to increased prejudice, as Jews were often stereotypically seen as more intellectual and successful and less nationalistic than others. Well, it sounds to me like we've got pretty much a case of petty jealousy, but that's exactly what people felt. But there was even a more comprehensive side to this that I will share with this class as we get into this thing. Okay, Hitler's anti-Semitism could have stemmed from these numerous other irrational prejudices, but its existence was used as a rallying point to unite the German people. And this was really sad. Remember, we talked about Kristallnacht in 1938, when the German people, Nazis, went on this anti-Jewish, I guess you could call it a tirade, and they wiped out a lot of the Jewish businesses and their synagogues all over Germany, Austria, and everywhere else. It was a pretty sad deal. If you know anything about Kristallnacht and the Night of Broken Glass, you'll see that it's a very tragic event for the Jewish people in Germany and in surrounding areas. The German people, in their quest for first economic and recovery and later for empire, Aryan nation glory, and world domination, they were, quote, the national master blue-eyed race. And this is how Hitler was keeping his people together, through extensive use of propaganda and outright lies to the German people. The Nazis claimed that the German people were a master race and used the word Aryan to describe them. Hitler claimed that all of this non-Aryan people were inferior, and he wanted to eliminate people he considered to be inferior, including those of Jewish ancestry, Polish, Russians, gypsies, homosexuals, and anyone considered physically or mentally deficient. Wow. So he had this blue-eyed master race in hand, and people in Germany were actually starting to believe it because of all the stuff that they had now were coming into, because they had money to buy things. Their lives were better, and they were actually starting to believe this stuff. That should have told anybody looking outside from in, or looking in the outside, that there was going to be some major problems. And this was a bad deal. Okay. Interestingly enough, people actually believed it through clever use of propaganda. Unbelievable. Okay, but they actually did it. Okay, the Nuremberg laws. Hitler and the Nazi Party passed the Nuremberg laws in 1935, which denied German citizenships to Jews and prevented them from marrying non-Jews. Jews were also ordered to wear the Star of David so they could be immediately recognized in public, and eventually they could be recognized and put into the trains that would take them to the concentration camps where they would be victims of the Holocaust. And as you know, the Holocaust can be summed up very simply: systematic extermination of these people. Very, very sad and very troubling. Okay, Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass. Remember, people, this was just, I wanted to go through the war a little bit first, some of the highlights. Now we're going to get into some of the things that helped create this problem. Kristallnacht, as I said before, was the Night of Broken Glass. On November 1938, Nazi troops attacked Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes and killed approximately 100 Jews. But they did a lot more than that. They set fire to their businesses, they set fire to their synagogues, they rounded them up, and they threw them in jail. And for what crime? Simply because they were Jewish people. No crime. Their crime was the fact that they were Jewish. Okay, the Holocaust. This was something of probably one of the worst events in all of human history, besides Stalin killing 20 million of his own people and other, countries doing similar things over history. When a government exterminates their own people, there's obviously got some problems. And in the Holocaust, these Jewish people were considered themselves Germans. In fact, they would have fought for Germany if they were told to fight for Germany. And looking back in retrospect of the Germans and what they did during World War II and some of the crucial mistakes that Hitler had made, he killed 6 million German people. They may have been Jewish, but they would have fought for Hitler, and that may have changed the outlook of the war, especially in Russia. But he killed his own people because the Jewish considered themselves Germans first, Jewish second. Okay, a tragedy, obviously. Okay, the Holocaust, Hitler's final solution. Okay. I'm sure everybody can see that. Go ahead, and I want you to read this, class. I want you to read it and think about what you're reading and how it would have affected the entire world if the world had known exactly what was happening. So read that for just a second, because this is a big part of Germany and World War II. So please read for just a moment. Okay, I hope everybody's probably had enough time to read this and understand exactly what this was all about. And I urge you to read more on the Holocaust if you want to know the painful, brutal truth of what Hitler was all about during this period of time. And one of the things that I'm always asked in my regular classes at school, I taught out on Saipan for over 11 years, which is pretty close to China, by the way. Is why did Hitler hate the Jews so much? It must have been something more than simply because he just simply didn't like them. And there was a lot more to it than just simply the guy didn't like them. And I will go over that with you during the last days of this class with regards to the question on everybody's mind was simply, why did this happen? Okay. So you know a little bit about the Holocaust and the horrible things that they did. This was all part of the grand design of Hitler during World War II. It was also designed to keep the regular people in check, so they would not ever move against the Nazi Party or Hitler himself. This is what we're doing to the Jewish people. If you don't behave yourself, this is what could happen to you. And interestingly enough, when the Americans would finally liberate a lot of these concentration camps after the war had been ended, especially in the camps of Auschwitz and Dachau, the people around the cities of these concentration camps told the American people, told the American military, they didn't know what was going on. Well, the American soldiers and the military said that that was a complete lie. They did know what was going on because many of those people worked in those camps and were alive and well, hauling the dead bodies out after they've executed these people. Yeah, they knew exactly what was going on. So the concentration camps and the slaughter of the Jewish people were to get rid of the Jewish people, but also to keep the German people who were kind of like not really sure about all this, to keep them scared and to keep them compliant. And this is important because the major question that I have in most history classes, all history classes, is that I always ask the same question. How come the German people let this happen? Why did they let this happen? Because they were afraid that if they opposed what was going on, they too would be thrown into a concentration camp and summarily executed for being against the Führer, Adolf Hitler. Very clever and very cruel forms of propaganda. Okay, the Nuremberg trials. Okay, I'm not going to get into that because that's after the war. Okay, I'm not going to get into this stuff yet. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this PowerPoint out, and I'm going to go ahead and share another one, which was the economy of the Jewish of the Nazis. This is a very important part of why Germany was so successful in what they were doing. People didn't realize that, but Germany had become a very, very successful country. Uh-oh, I lost it. Okay, should be able to see it now. Okay, I pressed the wrong button. Okay, the economy under the Nazi Germany. This is a very important part of why they were able to do what they did. So let's figure this out, because a good question is, how did they afford all this military stuff? And how did they, well, what made Germany so successful so quickly? Remember, after World War I, Germany was a wipeout. They were completely devastated. They had no industry. They had no jobs. They had high international debt, and they were made to pay for everything because of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler comes to power, and all of a sudden, things started to get a lot better. So let's figure out what Hitler was faced with and what he did. Because when he did this, this would add a lot of credibility to what he was preaching to of the German people. Follow me, I will make your lives better. And if you do what I tell you to do, your life will be not only better, but it will be more profitable, and I will make you proud to be an Aryan German again. Again, another way why and how he was able to control his people to eventually get into this. Okay, so in this presentation, we will look at three things. Why or what major problems did Hitler have? Well, first, he had a staggering international debt, agricultural stagnation, and we have industrial unemployment. For each problem, we will consider the nature of the problem, the policies adapted by the Nazis, Hitler, and how they dealt with it, and the success of these policies. Okay, I'm not going to get into this particular one. I'm not going to get into an introductory quiz, but I will. In fact, I have given this PowerPoint to Miss Annie. She has it. If you feel that you want to take a look at it, by all means. Okay, so here's what it was all about. Unemployment. The number of unemployed people in Germany came down quickly after 1933. Remember, Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933. And 52 days later, he was considered to be the dictator, the father of Germany. 6 million people were unemployed, registered in 1933. By 1934, there was only 3.8 million people. So he reduced unemployment by 2.2 million people. That's huge in only 1 year. The number went down in 1939 to only 300,000 people. Wow. I mean, if numbers like that, that's startling. It's called the German economic miracle of the early 1930s. And this is exactly what had happened. He decreased employment or unemployment by almost 6 million jobs. And in a country the size of Germany, that's staggering. Okay, this was a great Nazi propaganda tool. Hitler becomes chancellor, and afterwards, he had a lot more jobs. Why? Because he rebuilt his economy, he rebuilt his industries, he rebuilt his country, and most importantly, he would rebuild his military to prepare for World War II. Okay, you can see by this little chart, you can see very clearly in 1939 to 1933, in only 6 years, he would reduce unemployment by close to 6 million people. Okay. Hitler, the RAD, and the DAF. Okay. National Labor Service, the RAD, Hitler's first measure to tackle unemployment, was setting up the National Labor Service to provide jobs he had promised to the German people. If he wasn't going to be able to deliver on his promises, they would have eventually kicked him out. People would have said, nope, not going to do it. But he gave people work, which made their lives better, so they believed him. The organization gave jobs to people in public works schemes, building schools, hospitals, motorways, and digging drainage ditches, complete infrastructure development projects. Very similar to what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in America during his first years of being president under what they called the program of the New Deal. Same type of progress, same type of programs. Hitler did the National Labor Service. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would do the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Works Progress Administration. Same type of things. The difference was, though, is that America was a full democracy. Hitler was a dictatorship at this point and subscribing to the fascism Nazi ideology. Okay, men in the red had to wear a uniform and live and work in camps. Their wages were really only pocket money, but for this was a vast improvement, and they were able to send money home to their families, and they got free food. So these were working, and other programs were working as well. They were making pocket money, but they quickly be able to save that because they were being fed and they lived in these camps. Okay, now we have the German Labor Front, or the DAF. Within months of taking power, Hitler decided to abolish all trade unions and in their place to set up the German Labor Front. The interesting question is, why did they do that? Why did they abolish all trade unions? Because the trade unions were there to look at collective bargaining. That would mean that you're going to bargain with the Fuhrer? No, you're not. You're going to do exactly what he tells you to do. And this is exactly why Hitler was so powerful, is that he eliminated these German labor unions that would have mainly and could have opposed him. So he just simply closed them down. And if you argued with him, you were considered an enemy of the Nazi party and you'd be put in jail. That's exactly how he would deal with any opposition to his power, was simply putting you in jail. Okay, bosses could no longer sack workers on the spot. Workers could not leave the job without government's permission. Only government-run labor exchanges could arrange new jobs. Workers could no longer bargain for higher wages. Strikes were made illegal because Hitler wanted the people to keep working and working and working and working, so to rebuild Germany faster and faster and faster. This was very important. Strikes were made illegal. If you struck, you were in a lot of trouble. Limitations on hour a person could work were abolished. Many of the German people were working 60 to 72 hours a week in 1939. And what were they doing? They were building war materials as fast as they could. This was not an accident, okay? Hitler's attack on Poland and his starting of World War II, clearly you can see here, people, this was no accident. He planned this from way long before it actually was carried out. By working his people that many hours, you know darn well that he was building war materials for a World War II invasion. Okay. We are continuing with unemployment, the limits of success. The unemployment figures in Nazi Germany look very impressive, but they don't tell the whole story. From 1933, women were no longer included in unemployment figures. Once the Nazis came to power, most Jews were sacked. Their jobs were given to other Germans. From 1935, Jewish could no longer hold German citizenship, and they were removed from the unemployment register. Interesting. The unemployed were obligated to take a job they were offered or else be classified as work shy and were imprisoned. How would you like that, everybody? You were offered a job that you couldn't stand, that you simply couldn't do, and if you didn't take that job, you were imprisoned. Is that a place you want to live? I don't think so. So this is exactly what was happening. And look at this. We have conscription, which basically is better known as a draft. Removed over 1 million young men from the employment market and put them in uniform. They were now in the German army. So people, I want you to make absolutely sure you understand this. Between the production figures and the conscriptions and the propaganda and everything else, World War II in Europe, from the German standpoint, was no accident. It was not something that Hitler just did on a whim. This was something that was planned for a long period of time. Okay, number 2, butter. Very interesting little acronym there. Dealt with by Hugenberg and Dar. Industry dealt with sacked of the new plan. Do you want butter or do you want guns? Nazi Germany got both, but they got more guns than butter. Okay. Here's some of the problems that they were facing. Because Germany had became such a consumer-driven economy, because now there are 6 million more people at work, they began to demand more goods and services. So world food prices have been low for many decades, which meant Germany had been importing cheap food from abroad. This is because German farmers could not sell their food at a price that they could actually make a living with. So this meant Germany was usually importing more than it exported, resulting in an unhealthy balance of trade. In other words, a mounting national debt. Moreover, dependence on imports was preventing Germany from achieving economic self-sufficiency, what they called autarky, which Hitler felt necessary in order to prepare the German economy for war. Again, like I said, this was no accident. How did German agricultural policies affect farmers? Okay, success. Farmers saw their incomes increase by 40% from 1928 to 1938. Food production increased. Why did their incomes increase? Because the demand increases. If you've got 6 million people now earning money, the first thing they're going to go out and buy when they get paid is food. So guess what? The farmers got an increase in pay because the people were now working to be able to afford it. As the production increased, the farmers were also increased. The production increased to 20%, leaving Germans self-sufficient in bread, grains, potatoes, sugar, meat, vegetables, and eggs. So this is a big, important part of why Germany was able to succeed, because now they could have the food that they desperately needed that they did not have during the Great Depression. Okay, some of the failures. It wasn't all perfect. Farmers came to resent the interference of the Reich food estate. Okay, Germany was now, and the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler was now getting his nose into everything in the German economy because he wanted to control everything. German was still not at a level sufficient to feed the German population without the need for imports. Hitler appointed what they call Hjalmar Schacht, the president of the Reichsbank, who quickly formulated a new plan which aimed to improve Germany's balance of trade. So what did he do? Well, I'm not going to get too much into economics, but what he did was pretty darn clever. He was importing food, but paying for it at a later date. He would created a debt instrument in order to pay for the food, knowing full well that he was now going to get into World War II anyway, and he would eventually never have to pay it back. Interesting. Okay, import exports. Okay, they would definitely get better. Okay, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Hermann Göring, rearmament, and the 4-year plan. Okay, this was an absolute plan from day one, is to rearm Germany as quickly as humanly possible. Okay, the rearmament was very important to Hitler. He was determined to make Germany ready for war again, which he did. He wanted to conquer the Ukraine and use its resources to make Germany self-sufficient in food and raw materials. Russia would have a lot to say about that. Moreover, rearmament was forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles, so Hitler initially had to conceal his actions from the Allies. When we get further into this 1930s and the 1938, 1939 era, actually before even that, Hitler didn't even try to conceal it anymore. He said, I don't care. Germany is already well advanced right now. It's got enough arms to sufficiently repel any attack from any of its potential adversaries in Europe. So initially, yes, he tried to hide it, but when he became strong and he knew it, he didn't care anymore. He said, there's no way they're going to be able to fight me anyway. So he wasn't even hiding it. About the time Kristallnacht came around, 1938, Hitler wasn't even hiding it anymore. He was going to rearm Germany, and he didn't care about the Treaty of Versailles. And he was actually right on this account. The Treaty of Versailles, as we all know, was incredibly unfair to Germany. But that would not justify what Germany would do in World War II, or even begin to start World War II. But unfortunately, history has a cruel way of saying, guess what? This is what's going to happen, and we don't care if you like it or not. But the one thing I love about history, everybody, is it tells you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Why do we learn this type of stuff in his history or world history? Is because these are mistakes. These are mistakes by mankind that hopefully will never be allowed to happen again. And this is why it's important for your students, my students, to realize that it's important to learn this, because we want to make sure that future generations don't go through what this generation had to and suffer like this generation has suffered and will suffer. Okay, because spending had to be concealed, a lot was the work was hidden in the creation program, building new runways, barracks, and motorways, autobahns, which is still there today. This only provided a few highly skilled jobs. He was hiding it, but as we would go forward, as I said, toward the end of this era, Hitler was not even beginning to hide it anymore because he simply didn't care. Okay, Hitler signals his decision to move away from butter and toward guns as early as 1935, when he reintroduced compulsory military service and set up the Air Force. Can anybody tell me what the Air Force was called during this period of time? It's called the Luftwaffe. Okay, Sack resigned the following year when Göring launched his rearmament program, which demanded people and called for workers, which would prepare Germany for war. Controls were placed on prices for wages, and vast funds were poured into projects to manufacture synthetic alternatives to create the production that the military needed, while not sacrificing as much as what was be expected by the German people. Germany and Hitler knew very well that if he's going to prepare Germany for war, he has to have the support of the people. But not only the support of the people, but the obedience of the people. Remember, class, there was a lot of people in Germany that didn't like what was going on here. And Germany is now preparing for war. people were starting to get nervous. They said, look, in 1935, okay, we're not worried about it yet, but people were starting to question about, hey, why are we doing all this? Our economy's good. We're doing all these wonderful things, but now we're starting to realize that maybe it's a little too militaristic for our tastes. And people were now starting to realize that we may have a problem. But did they say anything about it? If they did, they'd better be in private. Because if you did not salute and hail to the Fuhrer every place you went around Berlin or Munich or anywhere else in Germany, you were considered to be an enemy of the people and of Adolf Hitler, of the Third Reich. Every place you went, you were scrutinized. They had Hitler's secret police everywhere, looking at people and looking at all the things that were happening just to make sure that people were compliant and not what they call an agitator. Okay, this is one of the most telling slides on this whole presentation, everybody. Take a look at this. The army grew from 100,000 men in 1933, when Hitler became chancellor, to 1.4 million people in 1939. That means that growth, 1,390,000 soldiers were now in the German military. These soldiers needed equipping, so 46 billion marks were spent on weapons and equipment, creating thousands of jobs in the arms and manufacturing industries. Obviously, these doing military service did not count as unemployed, and this took 1.3 million off the unemployment register. Interesting. Sachs argued that this policy was not providing long-term stability, but merely gearing the European country of Germany for a catastrophic European war. Well, how about that? We have a military leader now starting to question, what are we doing? Well, it became pretty clear what Hitler was doing. Okay. Last slide, and then I'm going to go into a little bit of a discussion. The plenary points for discussion. In this presentation, you've learned about the role played by, okay, I'm not going to give you this little test, but what's important to understand, class, is that when the German economy was in its full outright production mode, we had 6 million more people that were employed. We had 1.39 million people in the army. We had a massive, massive buildup of aircraft. In fact, an Air Force was actually created, the Luftwaffe. Plus, we had more ships, more army, more guns, more tanks. What did you think was going to happen? I mean, people in Europe started to see it, but they didn't think it was, they said, we think it might happen. That's why the European allies, well, would soon be allies, were beginning to appease Hitler. They said, look, man, okay, we understand very clearly what you've done, and we salute you with the fact that you've rebuilt your country and your military. But do you really need that many airplanes and that many people in your army and that many ships and that many guns? And people were now starting to realize what had happened. And what happened was very clear. Germany was preparing for World War II. And then the thing that cemented all of it was his treatment of the Jewish people. They realized that Hitler has no moral turpitude about people in general. People were considered tools, and they were used at the worst way that you could use a human life. And the way that the Jews were treated and they were thrown in jail, it was terrible. And the German people to say after World War II that they knew nothing of the treatment of the Jewish Holocaust, or the cause of it, or the Jewish Holocaust in its own right, is an outright lie. And that's why the German people were given very little as far as, I guess, consolidation after the war. They certainly weren't worth it. There was a lot of people that were very upset when this war would break out and at this war's end, because you realized history accounts that Hitler actually committed suicide. And there's a lot of people now believe that maybe he didn't commit suicide. I'm not going to get into a big conspiracy theory this evening, but people were actually starting to realize that maybe he got away. And some people think he moved to South America. And there's a lot of compelling evidence that supports that claim. But there's also a lot of compelling evidence that Hitler went down with Germany as well. So nobody really knows what really happened. But the next time we get together next week, people, we're going to get into the direct action of World War II. We're going to get into the invasion of Poland. And we're going to get into some of the major battles that happened. And most importantly, we're going to get into the treaty between Russia and Germany, but Hitler would break that treaty and attack Russia anyway, which was the first of 3 huge mistakes by Adolf Hitler that cost him not only the war, but it cost him the lives of millions of the German people. Okay, well, I'm just about done for the evening. Does anybody have any questions?
Mr. Courtney?
Yes, hi.
Why did Hitler want to take over Europe and Africa, and what would he do with all the land?
Good question. Okay, what he did and why he did it was he wanted Europe and he wanted Africa because he wanted to control vast sums of natural resources. Okay, when you have natural resources like coal, lumber, minerals, gold, food production capabilities, and people, that means you amass power. Hitler wanted power more than anything else for the German Aryan race and himself.
Thank you for answering my question.
Of course. Thank you for asking. Okay, there's another one here. It says in 60 to 72 hours a week, a lot compared to today. Okay, yeah, that's a lot of hours worked, everybody. If you work 60 to 72 hours a week, that's hard. Okay, that's hard, but people did it because they wanted to make money, but they also felt that they had to do it for Adolf Hitler. And they were fearful that if they didn't work that much, they may be considered lazy and an enemy of the German people in the Third Reich. Fear and intimidation. The next question I have is, why do people want to start wars? Can they just shake hands with each other? That's a very good question. Again, all throughout history, there's been many, many, many wars, people. All the way back, clear to the ancient world history days, there's always been war. It's because of people that are greedy and they want power and they want everything for themselves. Usually it's about territory and wealth. It's unfortunate, but it's true. But that's why we want to learn history, because we want to see the mistakes of our past. We want to learn from these mistakes so they won't happen in the future. Okay, next class is, if Hitler got rid of the Jews, won't his economy also go down? Yeah, as a matter of fact, it did go down. Remember, the Jewish people, they ate food, they spent money too, and it hurt the economy initially. But when they realized that they didn't have to feed 6 million people, it kind of evened out. But that's a very good question. Hitler's treatment of the Jews would be one of his 3 biggest mistakes. Because remember, people, those 6 million people would have fought for Germany if they were given the opportunity and the directive to do so. But because they were Jewish, they were eliminated. A very, very bad mistake by Adolf Hitler. Okay, anything else? These are good questions. I like these. Okay, anybody else? Good question, everybody. Okay, remember, next time when we get together, we're going to get into the actual war years itself. We're going to talk about the invasion of Poland in 1939. We're going to talk about the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, and the Luftwaffe, about what they were able to do. So, good class tonight. I really enjoyed the questions. Thank you very much, everybody. I look forward to seeing you next week. That's it.